I'll go upstairs and I'll go live on my phone, okay? Just to see if everything's happening.
We're just testing to make sure this thing is working. And I clearly don't need to look at the keyboard because otherwise it looks like I'm staring at your feet. So let's make this happen. Gia's checking it right now. So if you're there and you're hooked in, just give me a minute and we'll start talking about wine. Wine, this stuff that I make. Boy, it looks terrible in that picture, but it tastes really good, even though it looks terrible. All right, just give me a second to find out if we're all looking good. All righty. Just 1 second. I'm so excited. Are you excited? I guess you could text me questions. Gia said, hi, Mark. So hi, Gia. Thank you for putting this together. For all of those of you who have never seen me, it really is me, Mark Vlossak, the winemaker and founder of St. Innocent. And I'm staring, you can't see it, but I'm staring at the Chardonnay block that we planted just below the tasting room called the Terre Dérangée, which means the mixed up soil or slightly crazy soil. And that's because the soil in that block actually came from underneath the building. So it has multiple layers planted, and we'll make a small quantity of Chardonnay eventually, maybe in 3 years, from that block that goes just to wine club members. All right, so we're here to talk about, I'm here. And if you send, oh, Mitch says hi. Hi, Mitch. See, I can read this stuff. I take my glasses off. Here to talk about the wine club for fall 2020. There are 5 bottles. One of the bottles there's 2 of, the Justice, which again, apparently because of the sunshine, it's very hard to see, but 2 bottles of our last ever Justice Vineyard Pinot Noir. So 14th in a row and the last one that we're going to do. And then you also have the new vintage of Momtazi Vineyard and the new vintage of Shea Vineyard, along with 2 different Chardonnays, both from Freedom Hill. One is the Freedom Hill. Boy, that reflection is just terrible. But anyway, Freedom Hill Vineyard 2018. And then the Kuvela Liberte, which is something that we've only done once before. Originally, it was when I guess, did an experiment in 2012 to see how indigenous fermentations would go, which is something that my friends in Chablis use exclusively. And but we've hadn't always inoculated our Chardonnay. We do no sulfur fermentations, but we always did put some yeast cells in them, cultured yeast, usually 2 or 3 different kinds in a particular vintage. But in 2012, we did an experiment, and after 11 months, we tasted the barrels carefully and I found that the barrels that were fermented indigenously, and there was actually 3 different lots for different sections of picking and picking dates that we did this for, that those barrels that fermented indigenously were just more nuanced, more textural, but more about the flavors and the aromas out on the very edge. Things that are really hard to define, but when you smell them, they're very obviously there. And there was just more of that. The wine was wider. It was almost like you were kind of up in space, drinking this whole textural dimension of flavors. And so out of the 50 some barrels that we made totally, and there was 16 barrels of indigenously fermented barrels that were indigenously fermented, we picked 10 and made Kuvela Liberte in 2012. Since then, we have done all of the fermentations for Chardonnay without inoculation. They've all been indigenous, wild, no SO2 fermentations. So we literally just press the juice very slowly and let it settle for a day or so and put it in the barrel and walk away and let Mother Nature do what she wants. In 2018, the Chardonnay was really quite lovely. We had a number of different lots. We tasted through them, and I decided that I would, instead of picking a larger number of barrels, I would approach it more like the Pinot Noir special selections and just do 4 barrels. So we picked the 4 best barrels and bottled that as Kuvela Liberte, which is essentially a wine club only wine. It's not available in the tasting room for general purchase, which made a total of 96 cases. The result is that the 18 vintage was probably even better for Chardonnay than I expected. And the Kuvela Liberte is dramatic in many ways. Probably the most interesting is that it really almost tastes like a different wine than the regular Chardonnay, even though it's the barrels with the same juice in it that went into the other lot. Just ones that seem to be more precise, a little more wine, a little more textural. And the inevitable question is, so why were they different? And the answer is, I have no idea. Mother Nature, God, Bacchus, somebody did something different in those barrels because they're all very old. There's no really wood influence in any of them. Each lot would be somewhere between 12 and 15 barrels that out of one press cycle, one picking and pressing. So the juice is identical. The barrels are, for all purposes, identical. They've all been cleaned meticulously, so there's nothing left in them from the previous vintage. And they ferment. And I suppose, depending on the powers that be in a particular barrel, certain yeast may take over in some barrels, even though the conditions are all the same and what went in is the same. Different yeasts will just activate themselves. Or in the fighting out, somebody won in some barrels and some other person won in the other ones. I just don't know. The answer is, I don't know, but it's really interesting. So I'm just I assume you're not all tasting, but if any of you are, we can taste together. This is the regular Chardonnay from 2018. Regular, not so regular. I think always very interesting. The intent of this Chardonnay from this vineyard is to capture something that is beyond just lots of fruit and a little bit of sugar in them, because a lot of Chardonnays in this country have a little sugar and essence of oak barrels or aggressive lees stirring, so you have a aggressive kind of lees flavors. The object of this is to capture something that happens in the vineyard and the interaction with the vines. Remember, Freedom Hill is a place that has very early sun in the morning. So literally the vineyard faces the Cascade Mountains, and as the sun comes up over the mountains, these Chardonnay vines are in full sunlight from very early on. The vineyard is also very close to or it is actually in the Coast Range of mountains, making it closer to the ocean than the vast majority of vineyards in the Willamette Valley. That means that the winds that come off the coast, or the cool air that comes from the coast into the valley at night, hits this vineyard earlier in the evening. And that gives you really nice balance of acidity. The vine isn't working as the sun sets, trying to do something, because it now doesn't have light, but it's hot and it thinks it should do something. These vines are cool in the evening and they're just relaxed during the night. The soil is the oldest sedimentary soil in all of Oregon. And the oldest soils in Europe tend to give wines with more minerality, which is my fascination with this site, is that it allows me to make a Chardonnay that really has minerality along with really pretty fruit and lots of other things. And in this particular vintage, the fruit is for me very kind of yellow fruits. It's like almost like some peach compote or dried peaches on the nose. Also some yellow flowers. It's a very yellow for me in my mind. It seems very yellow. And there's a lot of edges to the aromatics that are bright and kind of fresh, but rich. There's a richness sensed when you smell this wine. Those same kind of things go on in the mouth. There's, again, a lot of richness, a lot of breadth, without any particular thing rearing its head and saying, just pay attention to me. And that's the kind of Chardonnay I like, one with a lot of balance and a lot of width. And this certainly delivers. It's not a simple wine, but it's also not obtuse. You can taste it and know what it is that you're tasting. The minerality to me is a kind of a stoniness. It always reminds me either of what a peach is like right next to the pit, or that kind of sense if you're in like a fly fishing river and there's rocks and their water's running over the rocks and you're kind of getting that fresh, cool smell. There is that sense that I get in the Chardonnay. There's also some really pretty spice elements around the edges of your mouth. I would say more like ginger, kind of a pretty ginger quality, maybe almost like a ginger snap, like a good traditional ginger snap. And maybe just a little hint of cinnamon that goes along with it. So really pretty wine with a lot of richer kind of white meat food. So you can have, of course, you can have with chicken and fish, but when you add some richness to the dish, make a sauce, make a gravy, something else, I think that this even gets more lovely. All right, Kuvela Liberte. I have to say, every time I drink this, I smile a lot. It's really beautiful. In 2018, we stopped using traditional cork. And I don't know if you can see the logo. Everything seems reversed on this picture, but it's a Deon Cork. Deon it's made of cork. It's all natural, but it has been treated to remove all sense of the thing that we call corkiness, the trichloroanisole, but all the other compounds that essentially mute the flavors of a wine and give you this musty, unpleasant flavor from it. And after years of trying to buy the best corks I could and working with the manufacturer that tests every bale of corks for problems with corkiness, and still can't get the number of cork bottles under about 1.5%. I thought, well, that's only 1.5%. That's not a terrible number. But then I kind of reverse engineered those statistics and said, well, if I make, 100,000 bottles, which I don't make anymore, but I used to make more than 100,000 bottles. If I make 100,000 bottles and 1.5% of them are stinky, that means there's 1,500 of them that are corked. And maybe more than one person tried those bottles. And they had the wine and they thought, boy, there's nothing too special about St. Innocent. That's not a very interesting wine. Because although there is the obvious corkage that people that have some skill in tasting will know, there is an equal number of bottles where the cork just mutes the wine. You don't really get the TCA and the mildewy smell, the wet cardboard, that. You just don't get the wine. And those people, that 1,500 people a year, or more than 1,500, again, if multiple people try it, are not at all impressed, for no fault of mine other than that I bought damn cork that had a stink bomb in it. So we are using Deon, which some of my friends say, well, it's not 100%. Well, it may not be 100%. I'm not really sure how, because I know how they make these things, and I don't really see how they can screw them up. But in any case, it's way better than even the best natural cork that I can get my hands on. So all of the wines starting in 2018, Chardonnay was the first wine we did it in, but all of the rest of the 2018 wines will have Deon closures in it. And the nice thing about Deon is that you can pick the amount of air, which is part of that is oxygen, that can move through the cork over a period of years. And you can pick a cork that's kind of loose and allows a wine that's young to be open up and fresh, or you can make one that's super tight, or you can go almost tight, and we go almost tight with the idea that that small amount of air moving into the bottle through the distance of the cork is actually an important part of ageability. So I don't want it to be zero. I don't want to put a glass hermetically sealed, melt the end of the bottle or something so that nothing gets in, but I want to control it. And the other nice thing about Deon is that permeability is the same for every cork. Or in a natural cork, when they've done studies, the permeability can vary 2 or 3 times from one cork to the next, and you never know what cork you got in your bottle. So when you taste a wine that seems really tight, and then you open another bottle and it seems really fresh and lovely, well, the really fresh and lovely one probably let more air in, but it changes from bottle to bottle. So this allows components in the cork, and basically, I think it's a great closure. Enough of that wine. Oh gosh. So I was talking with my assistant winemaker Alana. We were tasting this wine, making some notes for the trade spec sheets, and we were both tasting it, and almost at the same time said it almost smells like there's really well integrated new wood in it. And of course, there's no new wood. These barrels are ancient before we use them, but there is that kind of spicy quality, that kind of sensory richness that this wine has, that almost makes you think there was some wood somewhere in its life, but not just stinky oak or smoky char or anything like that. Just that kind of beautiful, delicate, spicy nuance that comes into your nose. It still has the yellow fruits, but they're actually in this not as dried, not as cooked, more of a broadness of freshness to that fruit quality that it has. And all my little, every side of my nose is kind of tingling when I smell it, because there's just so many things that are being stimulated. Oh. It's worth the price. For me, this wine, it just has more places in my mouth are coated with more things. The balance of the acidity is just right there with the flavors. It's like everything is brightening and sparkling across my palate, and It really is lovely. So remember, you get one bottle. If you're Heritage, you got a second bottle. There is some more to sell. We don't have enough wine club members to go through the 1,160 bottles that we made. Or Reg Wine Club members that will go through that. So there is some you can get, and in the 18th to Josh Reynolds at Venice, and we were a little bit late in getting them out. So his first review came out without our wines, and then he called me and said, "I really want to taste your wines, and can you send them to me?" And I was like, "Yeah, I'll send them all right away." So I expect that in the next bit he'll come out, and hopefully he will like this as much as I like it, because I think that it's just a really beautiful wine. All right. So in terms of power, we would do Momtazi last, but in terms of complexity, I'm going to do Momtazi first because these other wines are really beautiful. So here's some Momtazi 17. Momtazi is biodynamically grown. The fruit is biodynamically certified. It's the Momtazi family. Their estate winery is called Macera, and they're in the McMinnville appellation, essentially about 20 miles north of Freedom Hill. So if you were to go north over the little foothills of the Coast Range into the mouth of the Van Duzer Corridor, and then head all the way across that mouth to the northern side of that, there'll be some very big hills sticking out into the valley. And Momtazi is the second hill, the lower hill to the south, and then it's the highest hill around. And then all of our grapes are at the very top of this hill that's kind of like a elongate or a stretched out dome. And essentially, these grapes, like Freedom Hill, get that very first light in the morning. But unlike Freedom Hill, which has a hill, right, it's on a hill at the edge of the Coast Range. So it's on a hill to the west so that the sun goes up and disappears in the trees over the hill. But at Momtazi, you're on a dome. So to the west, the hill drops back down, not to sea level, but goes significantly down. And so from the top of the dome, you actually see the Coast Range of mountains. And so the sun has more hours of sun. There's more light all the way into the end of the day at Momtazi than really any other site that we work with. So the total number of hours of light are stretched out. The skins, once they achieve color, so after veraison, which usually takes place sometime in August, this year was kind of around the middle of August. Once the grapes have color, they start to intercept the light and the pigments are stimulated by more light. So more hours of light give you more pigments, more kinds of phenolics, which are the tannins, the flavor, and the color pigments. All of those things that make red wine different than white wine are all affected by how much light is actually striking the cluster. And because of this dome and this incredible exposure of these grapes, you have the sun not only striking the canopy during part of the day, but going all the way over the sky and striking the other part of the canopy all the way into the evening. So all sides of these grapes are getting coated with light. And so the skins all the way around symmetrically are getting exposed to light and responding to it. And that basically gives you more tannins to extract. And more is not better, but more is what Momtazi has. And so in order to manage that, we tend to ferment Momtazi a little bit cooler and press it a little bit lighter and generally use a little bit less new wood because it already has a lot of natural skin tannins in it. And what we want to do is find that balance point where we express what's unique about Momtazi, which is that richness and proliferation of all kinds of flavor and color compounds, but also we keep that in balance with the acidity and all the other things that are happening in the glass. So 17 was a what we are vanishingly calling a normal vintage in Oregon. So at some long period of time ago, we had normal. Back in the 90s and 2000s, we had sort of normal years. And in normal years, we would start picking Pinot Noir at the very end of September into October. There's become less of what you might call normal or maybe average, but classic. There, G is helping me. A classic vintage. And what's happening is that we're getting more deviation from that center normal way we pick. Certainly on the average, it's getting warmer. We have earlier springs and we're picking earlier. In fact, in 14, 15, and 16, we had 3 vintages almost identical that were very early. Instead of blooming around the 15th or 20th of June, we bloomed at about the 1st of June, some places even in the very end of May. So we were picking in the middle of September or even the second week of September, something we used to almost never do. That happened 3 years in a row. And those years were also quite warm overall. So the entire growing season in 14 was the warmest season we'd ever recorded. Interestingly, that doesn't mean that it was hot on any particular day, because there was no single day in 2014 where we broke a heat record, but it just was warm all summer. 15 followed similarly, 16 followed similarly. So what are the differences between those vintages? Well, it really had to do with the time when most of the flavor actually gets created in the balance in the fruit, and that's in the last week before we pick it. When it's getting ripe, all the flavors are kind of starting to explode. The interactions of these flavors, whether they're fruit or spice or earth or barnyard or whatever, that balance of those things, the acidity is all really created in that last 7 to 10 days. And in 15, it was cooler of the 3, and in 16, it was warmer of the 3. So we have 3 vintages you've been drinking for a while that are all they're actually quite good because almost no disease pressure. Everything was healthy. The fruit was picked ripe. But not overripe. It was really quite nice. Then in 17, we basically went back to blooming after the middle of June and picking the very end of September into October. So Tazi was picked October 3rd and October 6th, because it's a high site and it tends to be cooler, especially in the fall. More wind to cool it off through that Van Duzer quarter. So that was, for me, really lovely, because when you're picking later in the year, the sun has moved farther past the equator, heading south. So the angle that the light is striking is lower. So there's less radiation as the angle drops lower and lower and lower. In other words, you can go out and sunbathe now all day and you're not going to get burned, because the sun is not right on top of you frying. It has to go through a lot more atmosphere, and the radiation that it carries is lower. That's why it gets colder in the fall, because the sun's gone away. So the same thing happens with grapes, and it turns out that couple 2.5 weeks makes a really big difference in the balance. So in 17, we have reasonable sun, we had reasonable temperatures, but it wasn't warm, and the radiation was lower, so that you had colder nights, which gave you a little bit more acidity. And you had, from my perspective, when you have that kind of a year, you have more of the things beyond just fruit. The things for me that really define terroir, that create more textures, more interesting interactions in your palate, because it's that feel that really defines a place. It's not whether it's strawberries or raspberries or blackberries or cherries. It's really the way the wine feels on your palate, the way it interacts in your whole mouth with all of the different flavors that we sometimes, I think, spend way too much time trying to say, well, is it cherries or is it raspberries? I mean, to me, it doesn't really matter whether it's cherries or raspberries. In fact, for some people, what it's a cherry flavor to some people is a raspberry flavor for somebody else. We're not all wired to, but it's more that overall sensation. And what I find in a vintage like 17, which is a vintage I like, is that balance of flavors is skewed towards the flowers and the spices and the earth notes. and not so heavily dominated by just fruit, which to me can be very monochromatic. And although fruit tastes good, I try to always remind people, you're not drinking your Pinot Noir with dessert most of the time. You're drinking it with savory food. So, why do you steak? I mean, I wouldn't, there are people that drink Coca-Cola with steak, but I mean, that's not my idea of a really interesting combination. So the notes in the wine that are more outside of just fruit, to me, really add to the experience of eating. More interesting things. So what does Mumtazi have always? What does it have now? It has a lot of really dark fruit, more kind of savory fruits, more black and blue fruits. It always has some really interesting kind of foresty kinds of notes that can move towards almost like a sweet tar. But in this vintage, a sweeter note than the sweet tar would have to be really sweet tar, maybe a little bit of licorice almost in it. And some nice cedar, and I saw that last year as well. That there was some like almost a cedar plank that you'd cook on. That little bit of that cedar sense. Again, I usually associate that with whole clusters, but there's no whole clusters in this. It's just again part of Mumtazi. So let's taste it. Here, the first thing that I'm struck by is the fact that this wine has acidity. It hasn't been cooked off in a hot fall. It's got freshness, this kind of zingy, spice-laden acidity that's very, it kind of accelerates all of the flavors and brings them like to a point on your a lot of those kind of savory earth, woodsland kind of things going on my palate, where the nose has, that fruit is a big part of it. It's much more balanced in your mouth. It's much more about, I just want to kind of like chew on it because there's so many things happening in my palate, especially across the middle of my mouth into my cheeks. And that texture thing is why I often refer to Mumtazi as, of all the wines, the umami wine, that there is just an added level of feel to Mumtazi. And when we go into the fall and we start eating dishes that have more texture, more things with mushrooms in them, braised root vegetables, casseroles, my cassoulet, which you can start to get the end of next week. We're going to do cassoulet dinner. We're going to do Sunday dinners, and cassoulet will be not this week, but not tomorrow, but in a week. That will be the featured meal, and you'll then be able to come to the winery and get a bowl of cassoulet. And this has that texture that I really love, with those kinds of wintry comfort foods. So Shea 17. I will say that if you want to send me, it says live chat, if you want to send me a question, I'd love to hear it. Or if there's something that you just want me to talk about, go for it, because as you all know, I can talk forever, and I've gone about, what says here, 35 minutes now on a monologue. So you know what? If you want to help me out, send me a bone, okay? All right, Shay. The dark red quality of Shay, especially the flowers, that I always associate Shay with flowers, and my Shays more than others with kind of a dark, almost dried flower. And in this wine, that is very evident. I'm really getting the violets, roses, but even maybe a little hint of marigold, just up on the edges. Just this kind of really rich floral layers of aromas. And then there is the background, which is berries, but it's kind of, rather than just being raspberry or blackberry or blackcap or Marion, it's kind of like a melange, not like it's mixed together, but that you can smell different berries. Like there's a bowl and you kind of move your head around the bowl and you smell all of those berries, and then a nice little bit of smokiness in there. Again, we've stopped using very much new wood. Shea and these other ones are coming out, generally under 25%. Shea is only 20% new barrels that are used. We've really gotten away from that barrel component. There is some amount of wood that seems to be really important for Pinot Noir, but it's way less than it was 20 years ago when I was past 50% for a lot of the big name wines. And I don't miss it. I think that there's more interesting things happening. I also find that as those wines age, sometimes the oak tended to just sit there and not really integrate. Where with less oak, I find that it more quickly integrates with all the flavors of the wine into some finesse. I didn't really want to spit that out. The thing that I'm in love with Shea is that there is so many things happening in your mouth with Shea. Other wines have these things they do well and really interesting. But for me, Shea is almost like a palate saturation. It's going all over the place, and you're tasting different things because, of course, your tongue has areas that it focuses on in different regions of your tongue. And this wine is actually like it's picking up not only in your tongue, but your cheeks, your gums, your whole, the other wines. And I really like that. All right, here we go. Do you only use French oak? Well, that's an inside question. Yes, I only use French oak. 20 years ago, 25 years ago, I bought about a quarter of the barrels were American. And in the old days, I did Temperance Hill exclusively in American wood. I've tried other woods, and I just don't find them very interesting. And the reason I used American wood for Temperance Hill was because it had a very focused kind of spice flavors and a particular kind of black cherry that seemed to play really well with the high vanilla concentration that's in toasted American oak. The French oak has many more flavors across the palate, more stick at a gas chromatograph, and you look at what happens. There are all kinds of different aromas and flavors that are just showing up over time. If you push American oak in the same machine, it doesn't do much until it gets the vanilla, and then it's got this gigantic, Mount Fuji of vanilla, and then it kind of disappears again. And what happened was that Temperance went from being conventionally farmed and by a person that probably wasn't as skilled as Di Chris, who took over in 2000, and Temperance Hill became organically certified and just was cared for and really started to show what it could do, what the site was really about. It didn't hurt that the climate actually warmed up because it's the highest and coldest site of them all. So as climate got a little bit warmer, that vineyard definitely got into places where it could ripen more. But as the wine got more complex, the American oak was just too simple for it. It just wasn't helping anymore. It was fighting. So we switched that last holdout of American into French. Oregon oak is just, I just don't, it's more sappy, I guess. I don't really like it. I wish I could put Oregon wine in Oregon oak. That sounds very romantic, but for me, it's about the flavor. It's about what's really happening in a bottle, and it just doesn't happen for me. Do not to have a certain wine this year. No, we didn't. We had fire and intense smoke at our estate, and had that vineyard that I'm staring at right now had fruit on it, I think we would have had significant smoke taint here. But we're on the east side of the Willamette River, almost in the center of the Willamette Valley. The day after it was, well, that was marching towards us, and I was freaking out, so I didn't leave. We were moving irrigation pipe to the eastern side of the property to put big guns out there and try to, if the fires came, trying to keep them from burning our place down. Once those fires stopped, the next day I went out to Freedom Hill and to Mumtazi just to see what was going on, and it was nothing like it was here. Temperance Hill was kind of the closest, and they ran an analysis on the grapes from all different blocks and couldn't find anything that was significant. I mean, you can always measure something, but it wasn't in a realm that it would be more than the background. And the wines from Temperance Hill don't seem to have any evidence of that, of any kind of smokiness. Everybody else was farther away. Shea was way farther north, although there was a fire in the Chehalem Mountains. It was, again, very far to the east, with the winds by that point blowing from the west, no longer the east winds that came out of the Washington Desert. By the time the Newburgh fire happened, the winds were blowing away from Shea, and I can't find anything there. No, and when I was at Shea, it wasn't really smoky there at any point. So I'm not concerned. But had we had fruit here, there's no question in my mind that I would be dealing with trying to get rid of the smoke taint. Foods that go well with Chardonnay. Well, Chardonnay food is, to me, it's pretty broad. I mean, I have done duck breast with asparagus and risottos, which I think is a really great combination. Pinot Noir. I think it's just a beautiful match. Obviously, you can do fishes and birds and all that kind of stuff. The way I think about matching wine at home is that if I'm just sauteing a piece of fish like sole and having with some rice and maybe just a steamed vegetable, then I tend to drink other things. So I would go for, a Loire wine, or I would go for a Riesling from Alsace, or an Arnese from Italy, those kind of things, or even a Southern French white wine, Roussanne Marsanne kind of thing, or Grenache Blanc, one of those wines, because there's a kind of purity and acidity to those wines that balances really well with that simple preparation. But when I say, well, I'm going to make some salmon, and I'm going to, instead of cooking it on a grill, I'm going to poach it or cook it in olive oil, essentially poach it in olive oil, and I'm going to make a beurre blanc, or I'm going to make a mayonnaise-based aioli or something with some herbs in it and put that on it. All of a sudden, you've expanded the flavor profile laterally and added something that has a lot of texture. And it's the texture thing that Chardonnay plays really well against. I'd say it's the king of white wines when you talk about texture. There isn't anything that comes close to the textural richness of really good Chardonnay in the white wine world. It's the king as far as that is. And it's the wine that will age, and those textures can develop in great Chardonnays. And it's the textural broadness that really is where the food match comes in. So, and a lot of vegetables with sauces, if you go to Alsace and it's asparagus season, and you have asparagus with what am I thinking? Hollandaise, or some variation on a Hollandaise. Another really great way to play with Chardonnay. Now, asparagus usually is terrible with white wine, with any kind of wine, but it's always worked with our Chardonnay. So, when it's asparagus season and I'm eating asparagus, I just tend to drink Chardonnay, because you can have Chardonnay with veal and lots of things. And you can have it with Blanquette de Veau. You can have it with lots of white meats where that isn't that bloody richness that you have in the center of a rare or medium rare piece of meat. But when you get out of that realm and you start doing things with sauces, with mayonnaise, with aiolis, with those kind of things, Chardonnay is great. All right, Mitch is wondering if you are using a Zalto glass. I'm not using a Zalto glass. I'm using a glass that I fell in love with again 25 years ago. It's a Riedel Extreme. It's kind of a bizarre Riedel in that it has this almost Zalto-like edge. Everything smells the same in it. It all smells really good, but it all smells the same. And I want to know what's different about the wines I'm drinking. I want to get the nuances, and I find that this glass with this angular edge tends to somehow funnel those different aromas into my nose in a way that I really enjoy. So that's what I use. Oh, right. These particular Chardonnays, yes. My comments are all about these particular Chardonnays, not about California Chardonnay. And it could also be, especially Chablis, Premier Cru Chablis. All those comments will go with Premier Cru. If you're drinking Grand Cru, else matters. It's not about the food anymore. It's about this exalted, hundreds of dollar bottle of wine that I'm cracking at that moment. I'm drinking Corton Charlemagne from Verger. I mean, I want to make something really good to go with it. And that would probably be like some pounded out veal sauteed lightly with an herb, a pan, the little crumblings with some wine and maybe a tiny bit of mustard and some herbs, and thickened it and poured over the top of it, and have it again with like a nice pasta with some flavor to it, something interesting. I'm not claiming I'm making Batard. I'm making you hungry. That's Gia says. Okay. For to click on how I perceive, just click with me on how I perceive and describe the wines. Can you comment on what to do first, last, recent vintages between the vineyards? It doesn't really matter. But I would, if it was me, I'd drink 16 for the next 3 or 4 years, and then I would probably have some 15s and some 12s and some 10s if I had them, and then I would do 17 the last, because the vineyards don't really matter in the short term. The vineyards matter when you're out at 20 years, and then it becomes Shea. Shea is the most interesting for me. But what we found is that Freedom Hill is also really interesting, and Temperance Hill at 12 or 15 years is actually insanely good. I used to not save Temperance Hill, and that was a really stupid thing, because Temperance Hill is fabulous just past a decade. It's incredible with salmon. It's with you grill salmon and you have a 10 or 15-year-old bottle of Temperance Hill, you're gonna like, why didn't I buy cases of this? Because this is insane. But for the really long haul, Shea is kind of the one that I always think of and that I always save a little more, past the dozen years. I want to have Shea past a dozen years, because for me, it's just really fascinating wine. All right, Justice. So this is the last. I can't say I'm happy that it's the last. It was a decision I needed to make to end. I needed to simplify my life and make less wines. And I needed to focus on the things that I had so I could make enough wine to sell it to a variety of restaurants and to sell it to you, and to sell it to retail stores. And there just was a very small block, and it was not enough to really spend a lot of energy on, but it was a little too much to just sell to the wine club. And so I was in a place where it was always kind of a struggle to like, well, can you sell through this? But it is the wine that when I go to Burgundy, when I go to France and I go to my friends, this is the only wine I take with me. This is the wine they love. It reminds them of Burgundy. In fact, a tasting that humbled me greatly was Jean-Michel Ganu and several of his friends from Rousseau. He had a bottle of 08 Justice, and he opened it for his friends, and put it in a decanter and didn't tell them. And at the end, they decided that they thought it was Richebourg, but they didn't know whose Richebourg it was. If you don't know what Richebourg is, it's one of the great parts of Domaine de la Romanée-Conti, or the Romanée-Conti vineyards, and produced by Domaine de la Romanée-Conti and some other people. And it is one of the greatest Pinot Noirs in the world. And I was humbled that they thought that maybe this was Richebourg. Gia,
Yeah.
this bottle is not right. See, it happens to me.
This bottle is not right.
No, can you get me another one? So, I mean, I expected a lot, and it's only halfway there. It's not obviously cork, but it's not obviously right. It's not the wine that I know it can be. She's going to go grab another one, and we'll talk about it. So, where is Justice? Well, Justice is in the middle of the Yosemite Hills, a bit west of Zenith, a bit west of Temperance Hill, about middle elevation. The really important part is the wind. And in Oregon Pinot Noir, Willamette Valley Pinot Noir, the wind tends to bring out spice. At Momtazi, where the wind is very fierce, the spices tend to be more savory. In the Eola Hills, in general, they tend to be sweeter, more grounds kinds of spices that you would think about. Justice, the wind is accentuated. So if you imagine if you were looking at an hourglass and the center is very narrow and you have the wind coming from the side of the hourglass, the wind would tend to funnel to the center and through that little narrow spectrum and then open back up again. And Justice is literally right at the center of that hourglass in the Yosemite Hills. So big bulgy hills on the top, big bulgy hills on the bottom, right in the middle. The valleys from either side come together, forming this little area. And Justice is on that, right on that area, but my block is literally right at the tip of that narrow spot. So in the afternoons, there's just a little more wind at Justice. It's a bigger part of what happens there. And at Justice, the spice is always accentuated. It also is the only site we say, well, what soil is it on? Is it volcanic, like Temperance Hill? Is it sedimentary, like Shea? Is it kind of a weird mixture like Momtazi, where it was essentially sedimentary soil that a crack in the crust, the Earth's crust happened, and the magma, instead of forming a volcano, just kind of squirted up when this area was still below the ocean, and kind of, so you've got this explosion of hot magma into this deep sedimentary area. So you've got kind of a mixture. But at Justice, you have layers. You have a layer on the top of the vineyard, which is all red clay, down about 2 feet. So most of the aerobic soil is red clay. And then you go down 2 feet and it becomes white. It's sedimentary hill. There's only a small layer of that volcanic soil, and then that old marine sediments are right below. So the vine is actually not seeing a mixture, but seeing two spheres of influence. One which is volcanic, which is richer and holds more water. One which is sedimentary, which is much leaner, much less life in it, much less available nutrients for the plant, and yet the plant is existing in these two planes. And I think in some way that is partially responsible for what I talk about being really interesting, which is the texture of Justice. So here we have another bottle here. By the way, if you open a bottle and it's bad, just tell me. We'll send you another bottle, okay? There we go. There's that depth of spice. That kind of dark red fruit, the earth notes, but up front, up broadly over the whole, upper part of my nose is this spice, this potpourri of rich spices. almost like what you might get in like a fruit cake or something, where they're concentrated and baked and, you know, very pungent. Yeah, that's what I expected. So the lateral texture of Justice is what's different about it. And especially temporally when that texture shows up. So in a lot of wine, that texture is very big while it's in your mouth or immediately after you swallow the wine. In Justice, it's there when it's in your mouth, but then it almost crescendos. It almost gets bigger after you swallow the wine and then just stays very broadly across your whole cheeks and your whole palate. And it's that the length of the texture, the richness of that feel that defines what's unique about Justice, and that it just stays with you. It's this rich, almost velvety velour kind of spice and beautiful things that are just apparently grow. I used to think it grew for like 7 years and then it kind of leveled off. But when I drank the first Justice, which is 2004, and drink 5 and 6, the wine just is continuing to get more and more interesting. These are not short-term wines, but they deliver a lot in a relatively short number of years. I mean, you're buying a wine that's, you know, 3 or 4 years old right now, and you only need 3 or 4 more years, and the wine is fully functional in your palate. I'm not spitting that out. I just love the feel of Justice. It's a very relaxing, rich kind of contemplation with wine. And to me, yeah, I'll miss it. So this is your last chance. The 17 is not being sold to distributors. It's not being sold to retailers. It's not being, this point, I mean, if some restaurants requested, I might send some, but at this point, the 17 vintage is really reserved for all of you and the people that come to the tasting room to enjoy. So it's an hour. And if you have other questions, I see about the same group of you, text me something and I'll answer. Otherwise, you can go about your Sunday, I guess, in any way that you want. Saturday. It's Saturday. Sorry. Sunday is, if you're not already hooked up, Sunday is Vicky Ann's lasagna bolognese, which is an unbelievable meal with some salad and some pumpkin bars that Alana made. And that's this Sunday dinner. So you can make a reservation or can just call if it's getting late and see if we have any left. I know that we actually have a lot of reservations for people that want to come. And so you basically get the lasagna or the cassoulet. So that they're the next 4 weeks. So starting tomorrow is, as I said, the lasagna bolognese. The cassoulet is the next week. Beef bourguignon is the next week. And then the 4th week, the last time we do this before Christmas, will be a roast leg of lamb. My mother's recipe of roast herb garlic leg of lamb and onions, celery, carrots, and just allow it with vegetables and a little bit of cheese in it that you do in a ring. So you get kind of a slice out of a ring, almost like a little piece of bundt cake. And so you get your vegetables in this lovely vehicle of air and loveliness. So that's what we're going to do for the 4th one. And then I'm pretty sure we will bring it back after Christmas, but with the holidays and everything else, we're going to take a little pause to regroup during the holidays, and then we'll be back with more food excitement at St. Innocent. Let's see, thanks. Status of your apple orchard. Oh my God. Well, the deer really love the the tender leaves of the apples. So the geese ate them 2 years ago and last year, but then the deer came in and started chewing away. So at least we have substantial growth, which we didn't have the first 2 years. But the substantial growth is still only like a foot from the buds from the grafts. So we're gonna try some other things this coming year. We're gonna put some tubes around the edges, and then we're gonna get the chili pepper, the capsicum sprays with some other things that supposedly the deer absolutely hate, and don't seem to bother the leaves, and we're just gonna spray those trees. Oh, our big gray heron just flew in across the field and landed. He's a very cool guy. So, Calvados is a ways off. My friend, Kevin's with COVID and everything else and all the other stressors. I'm just not taking on another project this year, but it's very possible that I will build them, has actually agreed to distill them for me into the future. So I've got a really great distiller, and then we'll bring them back and age them in a variety of different things. This particular distiller does some whiskeys in Pinot Noir barrels, and they're really interesting. So we might even try a little bit of an older Pinot Noir barrel and see how that works with it. So let's see, anything else? Our Sunday dinners inside or outside? They're whatever you want. I mean, it's space because now there's no more grapes in the crush pad, so you can be splayed out over the space outside of the tasting room, the package, and pick it up and take it home and eat it wherever you want, in your car, in your back seat, and on your own deck, in your own home. Where you don't have to just have it here. But I don't know how close we are to being sold out of this one. We'll have lots of Cassoulet, but the other offerings will be somewhat more limited. So I think we're well on our way past 30 servings. You can go to Fair Harbor at our website and go to Fair Harbor, and what can they do? Push some buttons.
So if they go to our experiences, there's a Sunday dinner.
Go to the experiences and to the Sunday dinner.
And they will have all the availability.
All the availability. There'll be an option. It wasn't very obvious before. It looked like you had to reserve it here, but when you went to the actual to reserve, you could have the option to reserve for takeout.
Yeah.
So you can take it out too. You don't have to eat with us if you don't want to, if you're not comfortable. But and if you want to sit outside, just bring some warm clothes. We'll put up the canopy and turn on the heater, and you can be outside even if it's raining. So we're here for you. Anything else? Starting to lose people. They're starting to go away. So I'm going to say thank you all for doing this. I wish we could do it in person. We thought about doing it in kind of a sip and savor version where you would come in and we would scatter you out all over the winery, and I would stand up on top of a tank and talk about the wine in this in the spring. We may come up with that option so you can at least come and stay 40 feet away from me, but by next fall we'll be able to do this together and enjoy it. But otherwise, I'm happy to have you send me notes and talk about the wines and show you bottles, even if they're in reverse order. Kind of weird the way they come up backwards. But anyway, thank you again and have a great weekend. Bye-bye.
Yes.